program called the WritersEye. I'm Steve Shaw, your host, and tonight our guest is Gyda Dicosola. And just to start out, I'd like to indicate a little bit about where the title of this program comes from. It's sort of a gloss on a quote by Joseph Conrad. And Conrad said that the purpose of a writer is, and I hope you can read this, to make the reader feel, hear, and above all, to make the reader see. And our focus on the show will be how writing is visual. And my guest tonight has brought a number of examples of writing. I'm going to take this away now. And also some pictures, because I think you also write from pictures, Gyda.
Yes, I do. Why don't we just jump right in?
All right, excellent.
One thing that I brought is a picture, a photograph of me taken when I was, I don't know how old I was there, maybe 5. And I've written a rather long poem. I'm basically a poet who's now dabbling in fiction. But I've written a rather long poem that I'd like to read an excerpt from that specifically mentions this picture. And I'm going to have to take the picture down now in order to read the poem.
Okay.
But I might be able to do both. And again, this is just an excerpt from a longer piece.
You notice you came prepared with your little black book, as all writers must have. Right.
And here's the stanza that has to do with the photograph that I showed you. Daddy's girl, caught in his camera, age 7. White gloves, ruffled socks folded once over my ankles. It may be Easter. Black hair, black eyes. My patent shoes swing from restless legs too short to reach the floor. He smoothed my dress and petted my hair while adjusting the light. The face in the photo is mine. Her eyes could be anyone. So it's just an example of how you can use pictures in order to access memories, basically. I use quite often pictures of my childhood in order to access memories from my childhood and sort of explore the feelings that I had in my childhood. I call it, the process of my poetry, I call creating my own personal mythology.
Oh,
and actually the poem that I read from is called Creating the Myth.
Mm-hmm.
And I use several photographs in the poem, including my high school yearbook photo, which we won't go into because right. I talk about wearing bell-bottom jeans with embroidery on it, so that dates me.
Everyone's yearbook has that.
Right.
I don't want to remember those pictures, please. It's interesting, too, that I do a lot of writing from pictures, and you can almost measure yourself at different times in your life. There's sort of a memory of the way you were then, but now you have the memory in writing the way you are now. I think Kierkegaard said life has to be lived forward, but it can only be thought about backwards. And thinking about it backwards is really another definition of writing, perhaps.
And also just the whole process of memory is interesting to me, and I use it a lot in my writing because memory isn't the real, whatever you remember are not the real events. They've been filtered through you, and they're very selective. And that's why I think that even the process of retrieving early memories, you're not really remembering reality. You're creating a mythology. You're creating yourself, in essence, through your writing. So that's why I find using the photographs so helpful from my childhood. I've also used more recent photographs, and we'll move on to that later. I have a more recent photograph of myself that I've used.
Oh, good. I'd like to pick up on something you said, though, because I think a lot of people have a different definition of myth, perhaps, than you're using now. There is the definition of myth, which, of course, means a falsehood, something that is untrue. But there's a more mythic definition of myth. There's a better definition of myth, which talks about writing in code. It's really psychology written in a different language than we're used to. Much of myth is metaphorical. And so that there's a truth embodied in myth, and there's a truth embodied in your own myth of yourself. And when you write, you sort of have to get down below that. Perhaps the metaphor of an archaeologist, where you have fragments. You have to put them together. The fragments are yourself. They're not a pot from an ancient time. I know many of my writing starts out fragmentary, and the process of writing allows you to pull those together and put them actually to put them together in several different ways. And I'm sure that you're using myth in that sense.
Exactly. And if I could just take the time to read one more very brief
Happy to.
excerpt, and this is from the same poem, which is a rather astoundingly long poem, The Creating the Myth, that I read from before, where I'm actually sitting in the bedroom and looking at photographs.
Perfect for the writer's eye.
Where is it? Hang on just a second.
Okay.
I didn't know that. Here I am.
Excellent.
Moonlight spills through screened windows over the rug scattered with photographs beside my bed. The light almost wakes me, illumes a recurrent dream. That really is the only reference to the photographs. Hang on just a second. Okay, I've obviously cut the part that I'm thinking about.
Oh, no.
But
Often happens to a writer.
Yeah.
Right. The outtakes are
Essentially,
sometimes better than
the image that I was trying to use was myself sitting by my bed with all these photographs scattered around.
Yes.
And then in the poem itself, I go through and describe some of the photographs, which are in essence fragments of my life,
Yeah.
and pull them together into a central mythology, a personal mythology, that's not a falsehood, that actually is the truth about what happened to me as a child,
Yeah.
my truth. And I think that that can be much more powerful and much more meaningful than what may have really happened.
And
what people tell me, oh, and when you
Sure.
were 5 you did this, or you went to the doctors when you were 7,
Right.
or whatever. Because those don't really reflect my internal experience. They don't reflect my growing up experience at all.
I find, too, to pick up on your point about almost correcting memories is another way you could talk about writing. I write a lot from Life magazine, and when I'm writing about my mother and my father, I try to go back and look at pictures of the 30s when I was not alive. And the pictures, if you learn how to do a critical analysis of pictures, they often tell you things about the times that the people who took the photograph didn't realize that they were recording. And that's another way of almost pulling the mask off our contemporary way of looking at things and seeing these with new eyes. I think that's another way writing is visual. After you go through the writing process, you begin to see something that was familiar to you before with a brand new way of seeing it. You behold, I make all things new, sort of. I mean, you rediscover, almost recreate it as a result of having written about it.
Yeah, I think the way I live my life, and I think that many people live their lives, their waking hours, their day jobs, whatever, but we're usually in a mode where we're not really looking at things, we're not really seeing, and that the whole task of writing forces you to focus in a very, almost like a laser beam, in a very tight focus. And that's something that we don't do very often in real life. And I find that very helpful. I use not only the photographs in order to focus down into something, but also just objects. Sometimes I can take an object that has some kind of meaning for me, and I'm not really sure why it has meaning for me, but if I just start focusing in on it and describing it, I will ultimately come around to some insight about why that object has meaning for me. And I use objects a lot in my poems, or that a poem will spring from some object that has personal meaning for me.
I think someone, it might have been Auden, said, how do I know what I think until I write it? And very often you have vague impressions of things, but until you actually think about those and go through a discipline like writing to get your thoughts organized, you don't really know latently how you feel about that. It's as if the writing brings that out.
Right. I mean, the thoughts are sort of flickering across your consciousness, say on a TV screen.
Yes.
And the task of writing is to reach out and grab one of those thoughts and hold it down, sort of pin it down while it's squirming around. It really doesn't want to be brought out into the light and be focused on. But that's what you're in essence doing, and you're seeing parts of yourself in a very tight focus. Sometimes that's not very flattering.
Right, but you have to have a lot of courage to write because of that. We're not only talking about the pleasant things, the memories, but also the ones that have been repressed that need to come out.
Yeah. And that is also a very very big area of my writing, that I have a lot of repressed memories, and again, my writing is an attempt to retrieve those. writing is a kind of strange endeavor. I mean, I don't know if I would say it's a courageous act, because it almost seems like we're giving writers too much credit. It's sort of like, oh, aren't we courageous? Pat ourselves on the back. But it certainly is incredibly difficult. And when I tell people that I write, people go, oh, isn't that nice? Gee, I'd like to write sometime. I think I'll sit down and write a novel. And I don't think they truly understand how incredibly difficult it is. It's not only the emotional difficulty, it's even just simply the discipline.
You need to be very organized.
I mean,
to write a
writing
novel.
can be emotionally exhausting. It can also be incredibly tedious, of just sitting down and putting the words to paper, nowadays putting the words to word processor. So it's not one of the, I don't think it's a courageous activity, but it certainly is a difficult activity.
You know, I had a friend who said all people can be divided into those who haven't written the novel yet and those who have, because on the other side of having written one, you're a changed person.
Well, does poetry count?
Through that. Yes,
I haven't written a novel yet.
I think poetry will count. We'll let you do that.
Short stories, yes. Novels, no.
We ought to pick up on another point that you mentioned just briefly, and that both of us work for the state, and we have to write on our own time.
Did we admit that on camera?
Well, we just did. And we have here a quotation from Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy about Leibniz, who was a really brilliant philosopher, but unfortunately he had the type of job that required him to please authority all the time. And he was the one who came up with the, quote, the best of all possible worlds. But that is not what he believed. That is what he said in order to retain his job. And there was another philosophy that he developed, and he kept it in his desk drawer. We have highlighted here, his best thought was not such as would win him popularity, and he left his records of it unpublished in his desk. That, to me, I think, that sentence spoke to me of an experience that I often have in working for working a day job and writing at night. Many times in a day job you have to say one thing, but there's an understated part to that. It's almost as if you're talking in abbreviations, and it only comes out when you go home. And it's like there's one myth during the day, there's another myth in the evening, and a writer has the assignment to try to reconcile those two. And I think Leibniz actually failed that, even though he was brilliant. It takes more than intelligence to do this. You have to be emotionally integrated in some way. And we ought to say, you don't start out that way. It comes in the writing. Wouldn't you say? I think the more you do this, the happier. Actually, you're happier in your job if you do it, because that part that you never expressed does get expressed somewhere else.
I think that's true. You know, I always have the feeling that I have one persona that is the persona that everyone knows and that is revealed during my day job and interacts with people. And then I have the persona that is myself as a writer, which basically only I know and you know, maybe a few intimates. And that persona feels like it's really me, which is really silly because I'm sure I function many more hours in the persona that's more of a mask, really.
Yes.
But I discount that. I say, oh, you know, that's not really me. What's really me is the act of myself writing.
We also have tonight a painting, and you mentioned the word mask and persona. And this is a painting I did about someone who led a dual life. It was partly a challenge to try to do a portrait of somebody whose face was hidden, but it's partly a metaphor for the masks that we all have to wear during the day. And this particular person, his name was Handkerchief Moody. He was actually a minister in, I guess, 19th century Maine, did we decide?
Yes.
And he actually, for his whole working life, 20 years or so, he actually was a minister who went around and went to funerals, went to weddings, gave his sermons, wearing this covering over his face. And Hawthorne wrote a story about him. He was really quite a famous local eccentric character. No one ever figured out why he did it, but it seems to me that there is a real metaphor, myth, something like you were talking about, that's encapsulated in the way this guy led his life. I think many of us feel as though we have to wear masks, but we don't admit it. He admitted that he was constantly wearing a mask, and the irony or the paradox of this particular portrait is that rather than hiding, I think he's actually revealing a truth that a number of other people do keep hidden by showing their best face. He showed his dark face in public. And I think he's quite an interesting personality for having done that.
It just occurs to me, I wonder if when he was alone, say at night, I don't know if he was married or whatever, if he ever took the veil or the mask off, if he ever looked at himself or if he ever revealed himself. Because sometimes I wonder, too, saying like the persona that I am exhibiting right now or that I exhibit in my day job, that's a mask and that the true self is when I write. But then again, is the writer, again, just another mask that I flatter myself with?
Right.
And, you know, it sort of gets into an onion kind of thing. You keep peeling away the layers, which is the function of writing, to keep peeling away the mask layers. And I don't know when I reach reality, and that might just be the function of personal mythology, is at some point you just decide, this may not be reality, but this is what I am going to decide it means, and I'm going to decide this is what happened. That's who I am.
The sin, if you can say sin, is being dishonest. It's not wearing the mask. It's knowing which mask you're wearing and knowing why you're wearing it.
Right.
That's the honesty that you have to bring to writing. It's not dispensing with the mask. It's knowing which mask to wear at which time that allows you to be the most honest.
Yep.
And as a matter of fact, you probably know this, but the word hypocrite is Greek for actor.
I wouldn't know that.
And in Greek tragedy, they wore masks.
That's right. I did know that.
And that was not perceived as being phony when you wore a mask. That was perceived as bringing out the true character in such a way that you experience catharsis in coming in contact, catharsis being a healthy release of emotion, as a result of seeing these people wearing masks. And the whole idea of a hypocrite there is not someone who deludes you or deliberately tries to deceive you, but someone who lets you see yourself wearing a mask in such a way that you can now admit to yourself that that's what you're doing. It's one of the great things about Greek tragedy, that they are very honest in their approach to emotions, and they're mythic in the sense that you were talking about in the beginning.
Yeah.
Do you do much about tragedy in your writing? Do you approach the tragic elements of life or in your imagery?
If you mean, I don't know if you mean tragic in the classical sense, certainly I think I have a write about a mixture of light topics and then a mixture of things that I would consider certainly more tragic or deeper that have to do more with my own personal life. Again, sort of the division between, I write some poems that are more about the mask that is me that I'm exhibiting now, this persona, and then I write poems that are deeper and further under the onion layers.
Yes.
So I have some light poems and some deeper poems too.
I think writing is a process, and that's another thing that needs to be stressed. It's not a product, but a memory of a thought process that you went through. And the thought process requires different masks at different times. And the myth is the relationship between those masks.
And talking about writing as a product, I think that's one reason why a lot of people are afraid to write, is they think once they set pen to paper, again, finger to word processor key, that they have to produce something that's finished and that is brilliant. And if I thought I had to do that every time I wrote, I would never write.
That's where writer's block comes from.
And a very good tool for that is to keep a journal. You don't have to, like a day journal.
Excellent.
You don't have to do it every day. I keep a journal and I do it intermittently. For several months I'll keep a journal, then I won't. And I won't make entries every day, maybe every couple of days. But I find that it really does help because it's a place where I can be honest with myself, where I can at least remove some of the masks and keep going deeper. There's also a difference, though, I know, between some writers write journals for publication.
Like Virginia Woolford.
Which is another kind of mask.
Yes.
While I write journals more for honesty and not for publication, although I certainly will go back and read through prior journal entries to try and get some ideas for poems or for short stories or whatever, because I'll just jot down thoughts. And I've also used the journal, sort of bringing it back to the pictures, used the journal to muse, if you will, on certain photographs and again why they have meaning for me. So I wanted to just read you a journal entry that I brought.
Yes, I'd like to hear that.
This one is fit for publication.
Okay.
Some of them aren't. Let me just show you the photograph first, if you can focus in on that. It's a photograph, actually woman over here with the dark sunglasses on is myself, as much as I hate to admit it, and the gentleman who's driving the boat is my father. And actually, when I had opened this little book, which I brought from my parents' house, this one right here, this picture fell out of it.
No, really?
And I'd always thought this journal book was too fine to write in with its gold embossing. It somehow seemed very daunting. But once this picture fell out, the very first thing I wrote had to do with the picture. And let me just read what I wrote. When I opened this book, there was a picture of my father and I taken in 1986. On the little boat, he looks tanned and healthy in a white T-shirt torn at the neck. I look relaxed and also happy, hair wet and blown back, huge sunglasses, bathing suit, Hawaiian shirt rolled at the sleeves, entering the picture through description. You can see our broad wake unfurling behind us, washing the mangrove prop roots as we plummet through the bay. Then I get into what the musing is really about. This Monday, my mother called to say she had to put my father in doctor's hospital. He had bronchitis, and even with a weak heart and lungs, couldn't breathe. She had sat up with him in their study for 3 nights. They were both exhausted. So basically, it was just one of those coincidences that my father, who has a very bad heart and has had numerous heart attacks, had a severe case of bronchitis and had to be admitted to the hospital and needed assistance to breathe. And at the same time, this picture fell out of this book, this journal that I had not been able to crack open. So it was a good way to start. It felt good to start that way.
Almost,
and just to let the audience know, my father did recover and is now fine.
Well, that's good. Because there is, there's an underside to the picture then that you wouldn't ordinarily know unless you wrote about it. Well, you knew about it, but, by writing about it, you bring it out. Something that's latent comes out to the surface.
And that's the way you can use pictures, say, for me, particularly in writing a poem, just as a way to access feelings that may be painful or may not be ones that you really want to get into. It's a way to sort of painlessly enter into them and explore how you really feel. Yeah.
There's a sort of theory I have that thinking itself is visual, that what you retain is more, you don't retain words a lot of times. What you retain is a pictorial image, almost like dreaming while you're still awake. And obviously anyone who dreams also is writing in their dreams, whether they're aware of it or not. But very often I think there's a side to writing which is somewhat similar to the way you recognize somebody's voice on the phone, or if you ever had the experience of being able to recognize somebody from the back of their head without seeing their face. I think there's a similar thing that happens in writing, where you get to that point of recognition. You have to use words to get there, but once you get to that rhythmic point of recognition, you're back into the visualization, rather, through the verbalization. And I think that's one of the things that Conrad is getting at, that writing is pictorial in that sense. To make the reader see means to recognize the character from the back of his head. That's good writing when that happens. We mentioned, too, in preparation for this program, that there are several writers, maybe Joyce is probably the best example of this, who write across as well as down. And the analogy I'm thinking of here is a crossword puzzle. One can do a crossword puzzle by just reading the down clues and filling it in, but it's kind of a torturous way to do it. Actually, it's kind of a dull-witted way to do a crossword puzzle. Much better to read the across and the down. And I think there's an analogy with writing there, too. I know I work on several projects at once, and when you reach writer's block in one, rather than continuing to go down and read the down clues, you start reading the across clues, start working on another project, and very often, by working on the second one, the first one will cure itself. And when you start doing this, I know Ulysses was written not one chapter now, and then we start with chapter 2, but 1 and 18, 18 chapters to Ulysses, but the chapters were written across so that the motifs were dropped all through the rest of the book as he's writing.
So he certainly didn't write them sequentially and jumped around and wrote whatever was feeling most immediate to him emotionally.
And actually that's the way we think. Yeah. We think across at the same time as we're thinking down. Blake's analogy is expanding and contraction. Eternity in a grain of sand is all eternity in a single grain, but the writer can sees it in its contracted form, but can see everything that would also be the expansive form. In other words, writing is not sequential in a straight line sense, but is more like breathing. It's expanding and contracting upon an image. And again, I think that's why writing and photography or writing from pictures or painting have something in common, because you're thinking more in visual metaphors rather than in a storyline with a plot. Although you have to have that. I mean, it's a balance between those. You can't just throw that other stuff away. You have to be aware of it. But if you're only focused on that, the writing will not be as good. And again, I think we're coming back to your concept of myth, that there are certain emotional depths that we have stored inside us, almost like a reservoir. And when you write, you tap that. Now, when you write many different forms, I suppose good technical writing actually taps it, but fiction, it seems to me, the assignment is to tap that. And that's what allows you to start becoming more imaginative, describing characters from a bird's eye view, describing their feet or something. You know, you start to get visual, and you start to be thinking about the character as having a characteristic gesture. And when that character makes that gesture, you know that that's part of their whole personality. Yeah, rather than some kind of description that just says he was very short and ugly or something. I mean, you can carry that across by the way the guy makes a gesture.
Well, it seems to me that, especially as again, I'm more of a poet, but the limited experience I have in writing fiction, and unfortunately my poetry is getting more and more fiction-like because it's getting longer and longer and longer. So I think that's why I'm making the jump. Yes. That the characters become in essence real for you. I mean, psychologically maybe that's a strange thing, but they are real, and they're fully formed. Yes. So when you look at them, you don't look and say, oh, he's short. You look at them and say, he's short, and in relation to all these other characters, this is where he fits in, and I mean, he's fully fleshed out. So that's right. In a way, you're always, what you have in your head, the character's life in your head, is never going to approach what you can even in detail describe on the paper. I know a friend of mine, I did the Masters in Fine Arts program through Vermont College in Montpelier, and one writer there I know, when he would start thinking, he was a fiction writer, when he would start thinking about a character, he would just take little note cards and jot down different characteristics or different things that he knew about the character and keep them in a file box. He said, 90% of what I jotted down never made it into my books or wouldn't make it into the story, but I had to know all those things about the character. Yes, in order to choose the correct detail. Right. Very good. The character has to be real to you. Yes. You can't just sit down and think, oh, maybe this is going to be a good character. The character lives and breathes for you, and you just are a scribe in essence. That's excellent. Guess we have to wrap up. We've talked so much that we ran out of time. It's been very pleasant. Well, I hope you come back. It's been a very enjoyable half hour. Thank you. And it went very quickly. It did go very, very quickly. Thank you, Mr. Moody. Okay, and this is Steve Schaff with the WriterSeye, and thank you for being with us tonight.